Look at them.
What are they doing? Let's go see. Okay.
Long before the sun touched the tops of the palm trees, when the village was still wrapped in darkness and the only sound was the slow song of crickets, an old woman could be seen walking toward the river with a wooden bowl balanced carefully on her head. Every single morning at exactly 5 o'clock, she made the same quiet journey. The villagers whispered about her, watching from behind half-closed doors and dusty windows, wondering why she always carried raw meat to the river before the roosters even thought about crowing. Some believed she was strange. Others believed she was hiding something far deeper. But no one ever dared to ask her directly. Her name was Mama Nola, and she had lived in the village longer than most of its elders. She was known as a gentle woman who spoke little but watched everything. Children were both fascinated and afraid of her. They would sometimes follow her from a distance, their bare feet brushing softly against the red earth, but they never got close enough for her to notice. To them, she was like a living mystery, wrapped in silence and early morning fog. The elders often shook their heads when her name came up, choosing to change the topic rather than explain the truth, if they even knew it themselves. The river she visited was not just any river. It was older than the village itself. The water moved slowly, carrying stories from lands far away, and the villagers respected it deeply. Some said the river had spirits. Others said it had memory. But everyone agreed on one thing. No one went near it before sunrise unless there was a very serious reason. Yet Mama Nola went there every morning without fail. Rain or harmattan winds, sickness or strength, she walked the same path, holding that bowl tightly as if it carried something far more important than meat. One morning, a young boy named Tund decided he would finally uncover the truth. Tund was known for his curiosity and stubborn heart. He had heard the stories, the warnings, and the rumors passed around evening fires. But curiosity burned stronger inside him than fear. That day, he woke long before his mother, slipped out of his family hut, and followed Mama Nola quietly, making sure to step only where the earth was soft enough to hide his footprints. His heart pounded as he watched her small figure moving through the mist like she belonged to another world. When Mama Nola reached the riverbank, she placed the wooden bowl gently on the ground. The water shimmered under the pale moonlight, and for a moment, everything was completely still. Tund crouched behind a thick bush, holding his breath as he watched her kneel beside the water. Slowly, she lifted the raw meat and dipped it into the river, washing it carefully, almost respectfully, as if she were performing a sacred ritual passed down through generations. Then something unusual happened. Mama Nola began to speak softly to the water. Her voice trembled, carrying words Tund could not fully hear. The wind shifted suddenly, rustling the tall grasses around them, and the river's surface began to ripple even though no stone had been thrown. Tund leaned forward, trying to listen closer, but as he did, his foot snapped a dry twig beneath him. Mama Nola stopped speaking instantly. Without turning around, she slowly raised her head, her voice now sharper than the cold morning air, and whispered, "You should not have followed me, child. Now the river knows you are here." Tund's chest tightened as Mama Nola's words floated through the cool morning air. He froze behind the bush, his fingers digging into the damp soil as fear crept up his spine. He had expected anger or maybe surprise, but her calm voice unsettled him even more. The river beside her continued to ripple gently, the soft movement of the water reflecting the fading moonlight. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Tund wondered if he should run, but his legs felt heavy, as if the earth itself was holding him in place. Slowly, Mama Nola dipped the meat back into the water and continued washing it as though nothing had happened. Her movements were careful and practiced, like someone who had repeated the same action thousands of times. Tund noticed how she handled the meat with respect, not like food meant for cooking, but like something meant for offering. The boy swallowed hard, remembering the many stories he had heard about the river during village gatherings. Some elders believed the river protected the village from unseen dangers, while others warned that it demanded balance from those who lived near it. Tund's grandmother used to tell him stories when he was younger. She spoke of a time before Tund was born, when the village suffered from strange misfortunes. Crops failed without warning, fishermen returned with empty nets, and people began falling sick with illnesses that no herbal healer could explain. According to her, the river had once overflowed during the dry season, something that had never happened before. The water had crept into homes, carried away livestock, and left behind a silence that filled the village with fear. After that year, many villagers believed something had angered the spirit of the river, though no one could agree on what it was. As Tund watched Mama Nola, he suddenly remembered that his grandmother would always grow quiet whenever Mama Nola's name came up. She never spoke badly about her, but she never spoke warmly either. Once, when Tund asked why Mama Nola lived alone at the edge of the village, his grandmother simply sighed and said, "Some people carry responsibilities that others cannot understand." At the time he thought she meant Mama Nola was just lonely. Now, crouching in the cold grass while watching her perform her strange morning ritual, he wondered if his grandmother had meant something far more serious. Mama Nola finally stood up, holding the washed meat above the water as droplets fell back into the river. She whispered something again, her words carried away by the soft breeze. Tund tried to listen, but the river suddenly made a low, bubbling sound that drowned out her voice. The sound sent chills across his skin. It was not loud, but it felt alive, like the river was responding to her presence. Mama Nola placed the meat back into the wooden bowl and remained standing there, staring into the moving water as if waiting for a reply that only she could hear. Behind his hiding place, Tund felt his curiosity growing stronger than his fear. He shifted slightly to get a clearer view, careful not to make another sound. As he watched, he noticed something that made his stomach twist. The river water near Mama Nola's feet looked darker than the rest, swirling in slow circles that moved against the natural flow of the current. He blinked, thinking it might be the shadow of the trees or a trick of the early morning light, but the movement continued, steady and unnatural. Mama Nola suddenly knelt again, this time placing her hand gently on the surface of the water. Her shoulders trembled slightly, and for the first time, Tund noticed how tired she looked. The strength she carried during her walk seemed to fade as she leaned closer to the river, her reflection breaking apart with every ripple. She whispered again, but this time her voice carried a hint of sadness that made Tund feel an unexpected wave of sympathy. Just as Tund began to lean forward to hear her better, the water near her hand stirred violently for a brief second, sending small waves crashing against the riverbank. Mama Nola quickly pulled her hand back, her breathing growing heavier. She turned her head slightly, her eyes scanning the tall grasses around her. And then, without warning, she spoke again, her voice low but firm, "It is becoming restless, and it has not forgotten what was promised." Tund's mind raced as Mama Nola's words echoed in his ears. He did not fully understand what she meant, but the fear in her voice was clear. He remained hidden, barely breathing, as he watched her slowly rise from the riverbank. She held the wooden bowl tightly against her chest now, as if protecting it from something unseen. The early morning mist began to thin as the first pale line of sunrise stretched across the sky, but instead of bringing comfort, the growing light made the river look even stranger. The dark swirl in the water had not disappeared. It moved quietly beneath the surface like something waiting patiently. Mama Nola turned away from the river and began walking back toward the village. Her steps were slower than before, and she glanced over her shoulder more than once. Tund hesitated before deciding to follow again, keeping a greater distance this time. His heart pounded loudly in his ears, but curiosity pushed him forward. As he trailed behind her, he noticed something unusual. Birds that normally filled the morning air with cheerful noise remained silent. Even the goats tied near the footpath seemed uneasy, shifting and pulling against their ropes as Mama Nola passed. By the time she reached the edge of the village, the sun had started to rise, painting the mud huts and thatched roofs in warm golden light. People were beginning to step outside, stretching and preparing for the day's work. Mama Nola avoided eye contact with everyone she passed. Some villagers greeted her politely, but their smiles faded quickly when she walked by. It was clear to Tund that she was both respected and feared. He slipped behind a stack of firewood as she entered her small hut near the large baobab tree at the far end of the village. Tund stayed hidden, unsure of what to do next. His thoughts drifted back to the stories his grandmother used to tell. He remembered one particular night when she spoke about ancient agreements between villages and nature. She had explained that long ago, elders believed rivers, forests, and mountains had guardians that protected the balance of life. If that balance was broken, the guardians would demand something in return. At the time, Tund thought they were just old folk tales meant to teach children respect for nature. But after what he had seen at the river, those stories no longer felt like simple tales. Later that afternoon, Tund joined other children near the village square, but he struggled to focus on their games. His best friend, Saad, quickly noticed his unusual silence. Saad was known for being observant and brave, often standing up to older children when they bullied others. She nudged Tund and asked why he looked like he had seen a ghost. At first, he hesitated, remembering the warning tone in Mama Nola's voice. But the weight of what he had witnessed felt too heavy to carry alone. Lowering his voice, he told Saad everything he had seen at the river. Instead of laughing or dismissing him, Saad listened carefully, her expression growing serious. When he finished, she looked around to make sure no one was listening before speaking. She told him that her father, who was one of the village fishermen, had recently complained that the river had been behaving strangely. He said the water sometimes changed direction without reason, and fish had been disappearing from areas where they were once plentiful. Some fishermen had even refused to go out before sunrise, claiming they heard soft voices carried across the water. As the sun began to set that evening, Tund returned home, but his mind remained restless. He noticed his grandmother sitting outside, sorting dried herbs into small woven baskets. For a moment he considered telling her everything. He trusted her more than anyone, yet something held him back. Before he could decide, she spoke without looking up, her voice calm but heavy with meaning. "The river has been calling again," she said quietly. Tund's heart skipped as he stared at her, wondering how she could possibly know what he had seen. She finally looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of worry and understanding. She opened her mouth as if to explain further, but before she could speak, a distant sound rose from the direction of the river. It was low and deep, like water crashing against rocks, even though the river had always flowed gently. The sound grew louder, rumbling through the evening air, and several villagers stepped outside their homes, staring toward the darkening horizon with uneasy faces. The strange rumbling from the direction of the river did not stop. Instead, it rolled through the village like distant thunder trapped beneath the ground. The evening sky darkened faster than usual, thick clouds slowly swallowing the fading sunset. Villagers gathered in small groups, whispering nervously, their eyes fixed toward the narrow path that led to the riverbank. Children were quickly called inside by their parents, and cooking fires burned lower as uneasiness spread through the air like a silent warning. Tund stood beside his grandmother, his fingers gripping the edge of her wrapper. He could feel her body tense each time the rumble echoed again. Around them, elders began stepping out of their huts, their faces tight with worry. It was rare to see them gathered without celebration or urgent village matters. Tund noticed Mama Nola's hut remained closed, its door tightly shut, with no sign of movement inside. The sight made his chest feel heavy. He remembered how tired she had looked at the river that morning, and her words echoed in his mind over and over. Suddenly, one of the fishermen rushed into the village square, breathing heavily as he tried to speak. He explained that the river water had begun rising even though there had been no rain for days. He said the surface of the water was moving in circles, pushing against the natural flow, and the usual calm sound of the river had turned into a deep, restless roar. His voice trembled as he spoke, and the villagers exchanged frightened glances. The elders quickly began discussing in low, urgent tones, but their words were too quiet for Tund to hear clearly. Before long, Mama Nola's hut door creaked open. Every head in the village turned toward her as she stepped outside slowly, holding the same wooden bowl from the morning. This time, however, it was covered with a white cloth, tied carefully at the edges. She looked weaker than before, her shoulders slightly bent, but her eyes carried a firm determination that silenced the murmuring villagers. Without saying a word, she began walking toward the river path again. A few elders stepped forward, clearly wanting to stop her, but something about her presence made them hesitate. Tund watched as his grandmother lowered her head respectfully as Mama Nola passed. That small action confused him even more. The villagers often treated Mama Nola with distance, yet in that moment, it felt as though they were acknowledging her as someone carrying a burden no one else wanted to face. As Mama Nola disappeared down the river path, the rumbling sound grew stronger, vibrating faintly through the ground beneath their feet. Tund felt panic rising inside him. Without thinking, he slipped away from his grandmother and hurried after Mama Nola once again. Behind him, he heard Saad calling his name as she ran to catch up. She had clearly been watching too, her face pale but determined. Neither of them spoke as they followed the narrow trail, guided by the growing roar of the restless river. The closer they moved toward the riverbank, the stronger the wind became, whipping through the tall grasses and bending tree branches in sharp, uneasy movements. The air smelled damp and heavy, like an approaching storm even though the sky above them remained dry. When they finally reached the edge of the river clearing, both children stopped suddenly, their hearts pounding. The river no longer looked calm or familiar. The water churned slowly in massive swirling circles, dark currents twisting beneath the surface like shadows struggling to rise. The gentle riverbank where villagers usually fetched water had begun to crumble, chunks of wet soil sliding into the moving current. The sound filling the air was deep and unsettling, like the river itself was breathing in heavy, uneven gasps. Mama Nola stood at the very edge of the bank, the wind pulling at her clothing as she carefully untied the white cloth covering the wooden bowl. Her hands trembled slightly, but she did not step back. Tund and Sod hid behind a fallen tree, watching in frozen silence as she lifted whatever was inside the bowl toward the restless water. Then the river surged forward suddenly, waves crashing harder against the bank than ever before, stopping just inches from Mama Nola's feet as she whispered words the wind carried away before the children could hear them. Mama Nola's whisper faded into the roaring wind, but her lips continued moving as she held the bowl toward the rushing water. Tund leaned closer from behind the fallen tree, trying to see what she carried, but the cloth still covered most of it. The river suddenly pulled back for a brief second, as if gathering strength, leaving the muddy bank exposed in a way neither child had ever seen before. The ground trembled beneath them, sending small stones sliding into the water. Sod grabbed Tund's arm tightly, her fingers shaking, but neither of them dared to speak. Mama Nola slowly removed the cloth from the bowl. Instead of raw meat like she had carried every morning, the bowl held several small wrapped bundles tied with thin palm fibers. They looked old and carefully preserved, each stained slightly darker as if they had been dipped in the river many times before. Mama Nola stared at them with deep sadness before lifting one of the bundles with both hands. Her shoulders shook as she spoke again, her voice louder this time, though still trembling with emotion. "You were promised remembrance, you were promised balance," she said toward the water, her voice breaking slightly. The river responded with another violent swirl, pushing water higher onto the bank. Tund's eyes widened as he noticed shapes moving beneath the surface. They were not clear enough to understand, but they moved in long, slow patterns that felt far too organized to be natural currents. He felt a sudden chill run through him, and he could tell Sod noticed it too by how tightly she clutched his arm. Just then, footsteps rushed through the tall grass behind them. Tund turned sharply, expecting to see frightened villagers running toward safety. Instead, several elders emerged from the path, followed closely by his grandmother and a few fishermen. Their faces were filled with urgency, but none of them looked surprised by what they were seeing. Mama Nola did not turn toward them. She continued facing the river as if she already knew they were there. One of the oldest elders stepped forward, his walking staff sinking slightly into the soft mud. His voice carried over the roaring river, firm but filled with concern. He called Mama Nola by a name Tund had never heard before, a name spoken with deep respect. The sound of it made Mama Nola pause, though she still did not turn around. The elder spoke carefully, explaining that the river had been growing restless for weeks and that the signs had become impossible to ignore. He said the old agreement had been weakening, and the balance that protected the village was no longer holding. Tund's heart pounded as he tried to understand what agreement the elder meant. His mind raced through his grandmother's stories, trying to piece together fragments that suddenly felt very real. Mama Nola finally turned slightly, her face lined with exhaustion and grief. She admitted that she had been continuing the ritual alone for many years, long after the other elders who once helped her had passed away. She explained that each morning offering was meant to honor a promise made generations ago, one that required constant remembrance to keep the river calm. But her voice faltered as she revealed something that made the elders exchange alarmed glances. She confessed that one of the sacred bundles had gone missing several days ago. A heavy silence fell despite the roaring river. Tund felt his stomach drop as the meaning of her words settled into the air. The elder's grip tightened on his staff as he asked how it could have disappeared. Mama Nola slowly shook her head, her eyes scanning the restless water as if searching for answers hidden beneath its surface. Before she could explain further, a sudden loud crack split through the riverbank. A large section of wet earth collapsed into the swirling current, sending water surging forward again, this time reaching Mama Nola's feet. She stumbled slightly but refused to step back, clutching the remaining bundles tightly against her chest. Behind Tund, his grandmother gasped softly, whispering words he had never heard her say before. Sod leaned closer to him, her voice barely audible as she asked what would happen if the missing bundle was never returned. Tund opened his mouth to answer, but no words came out. At that exact moment, the dark swirling beneath the river surface began rising closer to the top, forming faint outlines that moved slowly toward the riverbank as if searching, or waiting. The river's surface swelled as the dark shapes rose higher, swirling just beneath the water like shadows pressing against a thin glass wall. The wind howled through the clearing, whipping Mama Nola's clothing around her as she struggled to keep her balance on the crumbling riverbank. The elders shouted for her to step back, but she remained still, her eyes locked on the restless current as if she was listening to voices no one else could hear. Tund felt his heart slam against his chest, his body frozen between fear and the strange feeling that he was witnessing something far older than anyone standing there. Mama Nola slowly lifted the bundles in her hands and spoke with a strength that surprised everyone. She admitted that the missing bundle had not been stolen or lost by accident. Years ago, during a time when the village suffered another season of hardship, she had secretly removed one bundle, hoping to protect someone she loved. Her voice trembled as she explained that each bundle represented a sacred memory tied to the original promise between the village and the river's spirit. Removing one had weakened the balance, but she had believed she could restore it quietly over time. Instead, the river had grown restless, remembering what had been taken. The elders listened in stunned silence, their expressions filled with both shock and sorrow. Mama Nola's eyes drifted toward the crowd until they settled on Tun's grandmother. Tears filled her eyes as she revealed that the missing bundle carried the memory of her own younger brother, a child who had drowned in the river many decades ago. The ritual had been created to honor those lost to the river and to promise that their stories would never be forgotten. Mama Nola had taken that bundle years earlier because she could not bear to watch her family carry the grief any longer. The river surged violently as if reacting to her confession, waves crashing harder against the bank. The dark shapes beneath the surface twisted faster, creating whirlpools that spun dangerously close to where Mama Nola stood. The ground cracked again, forcing several villagers to retreat. Tun's grandmother stepped forward, her voice breaking as she called out to Mama Nola, telling her that grief was never meant to be carried alone. Her words seemed to echo across the clearing, cutting through the roar of the water. Mama Nola's hands shook as she clutched the remaining bundles. With slow, painful steps, she moved closer to the edge, lifting them toward the river. She whispered an apology, her voice filled with both regret and acceptance. One by one, she placed the bundles into the churning water. Each time a bundle touched the surface, the river's violent movement softened slightly, the swirling shapes fading deeper below. The wind began to slow, and the heavy rumble beneath the ground weakened with every offering returned. When she reached the final bundle, Mama Nola hesitated. Her body trembled, and she closed her eyes as if gathering the last of her strength. Tund noticed how the river had grown strangely quiet, as though waiting. With a deep breath, she lowered the final bundle into the water. The moment it slipped beneath the surface, the swirling current suddenly stilled. The dark shapes dissolved into the river's depth, and the water slowly returned to its familiar gentle flow. The heavy wind faded, leaving behind only the soft sound of water brushing against the riverbank. Relief spread across the villagers as they watched the river calm completely. Several elders stepped forward to help Mama Nola away from the edge, but she collapsed to her knees, exhausted and weak. Tun's grandmother rushed to her side, holding her shoulders gently as tears ran down both their faces. The tension that had gripped the village for weeks seemed to lift in that single moment, replaced by a fragile sense of peace. As the villagers began helping one another back toward the path, Tund glanced toward the river one last time. The water looked calm, almost innocent, reflecting the brightening sky. But as he turned to leave, something caught his eye near the muddy edge of the bank. Half buried in the wet soil was a small palm fiber string, identical to the ones that had tied the sacred bundles. He stepped closer, his breath catching as he noticed the string was still wrapped around a small piece of cloth, soaked but clearly separate from the bundles Mama Nola had returned. Tund stared at it, confusion rising in his chest as the quiet river flowed peacefully beside him, as if nothing had ever been disturbed. Tund bent down slowly, his fingers hovering over the soaked piece of cloth tied with the palm fiber string. The ground beneath it was soft, and the water gently washed against the edge of the fabric as if trying to pull it back into the river. His heart pounded as he carefully picked it up. The cloth felt heavier than he expected, and he could feel something small wrapped inside it. For a moment, he stood frozen, unsure of what to do, while the rest of the villagers began guiding Mama Nola away from the riverbank. Saad noticed he had stopped and hurried back toward him. Her eyes widened when she saw the bundle in his hands. She whispered his name sharply, warning him that he should not touch things connected to the river's ritual. But Tund shook his head slowly, his mind racing. If Mama Nola had returned all the sacred bundles, then how could one still be here? The question pressed heavily on him, and he knew ignoring it would not bring him peace. Before he could decide what to do next, his grandmother called his name from the path. Her voice carried both urgency and relief. Tund quickly wrapped the bundle back in the cloth and slipped it carefully into the fold of his shirt, hiding it close to his chest. He followed Saad back toward the others, trying to keep his face calm, though his thoughts moved wildly inside him. Back in the village, Mama Nola was placed on a woven mat outside her hut while elders and healers surrounded her. The entire village gathered quietly, everyone waiting to see if she would recover from the exhausting ritual. Tun stayed close to his grandmother, watching as she prepared herbal mixtures to help Mama Nola regain her strength. Saad remained beside him, her eyes occasionally glancing toward the hidden bundle as if she could sense the weight of what he carried. As the evening deepened, Mama Nola finally opened her eyes. A wave of relief spread through the villagers, and several elders stepped closer to speak with her. She explained that the river had accepted the offerings and that the balance had been restored for now. However, she also warned that the ritual was never meant to be handled by one person alone. The responsibility was meant to be shared across generations, with the community remembering the promises made to the river and the memories tied to it. Her words stirred quiet conversations among the elders. Many admitted they had allowed the old traditions to fade, believing they were no longer necessary in modern times. Others confessed they had avoided the responsibility out of fear or misunderstanding. Mama Nola spoke gently but firmly, reminding them that traditions were not just about fear or superstition, but about remembering history, loss, and respect for the forces that supported their survival. That night, as villagers lit lanterns and cooking fires, the atmosphere slowly shifted from fear to reflection. Families gathered together, sharing old stories that had not been spoken in years. Fishermen talked about the river with renewed respect, promising to teach younger generations how to care for it properly. The children listened closely, their usual laughter replaced by quiet curiosity and wonder. Later, inside his family hut, Tund could no longer hold his secret. He showed the bundle to his grandmother and Saad, placing it carefully on the floor between them. His grandmother stared at it for a long time, her face growing pale as she gently untied the palm fiber string. Inside the cloth was a small carved wooden charm, worn smooth by time and water. Tears filled her eyes as she held it in her trembling hands. She explained that the charm belonged to her younger brother, the same one Mama Nola had mentioned earlier. It was something he carried everywhere as a child. When he drowned in the river many years ago, the charm was believed to have been lost with him. The elders had created the sacred bundle in his memory, using pieces of cloth and objects connected to his life. Seeing the charm again felt like reopening a door to a grief she had carried quietly for decades. Tund asked softly why the charm had not returned with the other bundles. His grandmother took a deep breath before answering. She believed the river had allowed it to remain behind as a message, not of anger but of remembrance. The river had accepted the offerings, but it wanted the village to hold on to its history in their own hands, not leave it entirely to ritual. The charm, she said, was a reminder that memories should live within people, not just ceremonies. The next morning, the elders gathered the entire village beneath the large baobab tree. Mama Nola, though still weak, sat among them. Tun's grandmother stepped forward and shared the story of the recovered charm. The villagers listened in silence as she explained its meaning and how it represented both loss and the strength of memory. Instead of returning the charm to the river, the elders agreed to create a small memory shrine near the village square, where stories of those lost to the river would be shared and preserved. Mama Nola smiled softly when she heard this decision. She explained that the river did not only seek offerings but understanding. She offered to teach the younger generation the full history of the ritual, ensuring that its purpose would never again be misunderstood or carried by one person alone. Tund and Saad listened closely, both feeling a quiet sense of pride and responsibility growing inside them. Over the following weeks, life in the village slowly returned to normal. Fishermen found the river calm and generous again. Crops grew steadily, and the uneasy silence that had filled the mornings was replaced with familiar sounds of birds and laughter. The new shrine became a place where elders told stories to children, reminding them of the village's connection to the river and to one another. Mama Nola spent her days teaching and sharing knowledge she had once carried alone. Though her body remained fragile, her spirit seemed lighter. Tund visited her often, listening to stories about the past and learning why traditions mattered beyond fear or mystery. Saad joined them, asking questions and writing down stories so they would never be forgotten. One evening, as the sun set over the river, Tund stood at the bank with Saad, watching the water flow peacefully. He felt different now, older in a way he could not fully explain. He realized that the mystery of Mama Nola's early morning ritual had never truly been about washing raw meat or secret offerings. It had always been about memory, responsibility, and the quiet ways people protect their community without seeking recognition. As the golden light faded across the water, Tund smiled softly, knowing the river would always carry stories. But now the village would carry them too together, ensuring that no promise, no memory, and no voice would ever be forgotten again.